Hello and welcome to the program. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky met with members of the newly elected cabinet of ministers. He's given them a number of draft laws and a tight deadline. The president's plan, among a number of points, includes adopting next year's budget, lowering credit rates, and legalizing casinos. And that's by the end of the month. Joining us in the studio to talk more about Ukraine's economic goals is Ivan Us, Chief Consultant, Department of Foreign Economic Policy at the National Institute for Strategic Studies. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So just to start things off, Prime Minister Oleksiy Honcharuk, he said that the main task of the government for the next 5 years is to increase the country's economy, and he set that number by at least 40%. We actually have a soundbite from him where he talks a little bit more about why he thinks this is a good idea, so let's take a listen to that now.
The main goal the government has set for the next 5 years is, above all, economic growth. We set a goal for the economy to grow by at least 40%. This is a very ambitious task, but realistic. It will contribute in particular to the creation of about 1 million new jobs. Another goal is the development of infrastructure and communications. 24,000 kilometers of roads have to be repaired. The whole country needs access to high-quality internet.
So, how realistic is that plan? I know he said in that soundbite that it's very realistic and it's an ambitious task, but really, if we look at it closely, how realistic is it?
Yeah, so absolutely all the targets that Mr. President and Prime Minister said in this meeting, because it was meeting of Mr. President with the leaders of Parliament, with the Cabinet of Ministers, where he said about many tasks for the nearest future that should be implemented, about some different laws and so on and so forth. And actually, as for this meeting, I always said that for me it has two aspects. First of all, its formal aspect. Whether the president of the country can give an order to the parliament in the parliamentary presidential model of ruling. It's actually not correctly as for me. But the other question, that the president at the same time is a leader of the ruling party, leading party in our parliament, and actually everyone associated the leading party now with Mr. Zelensky. And that's why his personal responsibility, not only for the work of the president as he is, not for the work of the parliament as associated with the party that associated with him, sorry for so many associations, nevertheless, Mr. Zelensky associated with majority in this parliament. Then, the cabinet of ministers formed by that majority of the parliament. It means that it's so associated with Zelensky. So currently we have such a model when everything in our country associated with Mr. Zelensky. About the figures, and the figures...
But just to stop you there, is that a good sign? That everything is associated with the president?
We will see, that it's, on the one hand, it's without responsibility, it's background for autocracy. And that is a menace. And we remember that in the time of Mr. Yanukovych, and Mr. Yanukovych practically controlled everything. He was a president, he has his parliament, and he has his cabinet of ministers. And there was no, let's call it so, talks, dialogues. So now we will see whether the discussion could take place between President, Parliament and Cabinet of Ministers, knowing that all those structures associated with Mr. President.
Right, but some of the goals that he set are very good, really. I mean, if he's looking to adopt the budget, if he's looking to root out any sort of shadow economy, he's actually suggested some things that need to be adopted that should have been done a long time ago, no?
Absolutely. So, but at this meeting, he writes something like a beautiful picture, what we need. Yes, I absolutely agree with the famous statement that the ship that don't know where he goes, every wind will not help to him. Put to the ship. That's why Mr. Zelensky shows that is our target. The other question is whether Mr. Zelensky is ready in a year report about those targets, or in half a year, because he wrote a very short period, what was implemented and at what share. And that's the main question. So now we see very right tasks, very good picture that he wrote, and the question to do, how it will be realized. Because when we are talking about 40% of growth of economy, I want to say that a lot of things depend on the base of comparison. So if we were compare with the 2013, when before the conflict with Russia, Ukraine controlled Donbas, controlled Crimea, we have one GDP. Then in 2014 we lost it, and 2015 was another loss. Then was small regaining of the position. But this 40%, as I understand it, will be comparison with the current situation, but not what was in 2013. And it's the first moment. Second moment, it's a famous credit of Natalia Yaresko. And in this credit, it was a statement that Ukraine, in case of GDP growth from 3 to 4%, should pay 15% of the figures of growth higher than 3%. Then, in case of growth of 4 and more percent, we should pay 40% of the figure higher than 4, without, of course, from 0 to 3, 0, from 3 to 4, 15. So I mean that it will be high payment. I calculated for 2021, the focus was 3.8% growth of GDP, that Ukraine should pay to creditors 347 million only because the growth higher than 3. And that will be a limit. That's why for the Mr. Goncharuk, the first thing that I would advise him is just to think that the growth higher than 4%, as he promised in his statement, could lead to additional 40% payment of the growth of some part because of this growth to our creditors, and that will create problems, at least. So that's why
in the long term that would
in long term,
potentially...
yes. And this deal from the year of 2021 till 2040, it's a very 20 years long deal. So that's why I advise him to be careful in his forecast, to renegotiate with our creditors the comparison base. Because if we are talking about growth of economy, and when he said about 40% growth, if we compare it with the figure of, for example, 2015, it's absolutely possible due to these problems that we faced in that time.
Right, right. So President Zelensky has also called for reform and instructed the government to begin preparing for the privatization of large state-owned companies. And he's also delegated the Prime Minister and the Economic Development and Trade Minister to be responsible for this and to hold the first bids in April 2020. So that's next year, next April. How important is this reform, and why hasn't it been done before, really?
So really now, as we see, a more than ambitious agenda for the nearest time. Whether it will be realized, now it's hard to say. That's why I think that in half a year at least, it will be nice to hear the information about success, at least at the end of this year, to see what was happened with all those targets for those last 4 months till the end of this year, so for whole 3 autumn months and December, and what was actually done. As for not doing that before, so it was a lot of interest that stopped us. For example, if we talk about land, one of the most popular now topic that you...
But we're talking about state-owned companies. We're talking about enterprises such as Ukроборонпром, for example.
Yeah. So as for Ukроборонпром, we should understand that there is aspect of state security. Taking into account the conflict where Ukraine now exists, we exist in reality of, actually we like to call it hybrid war. But actually, I like to say that it's non-line war when there is no clear lines. But nevertheless, it's a war. It's conflict, and people die in this conflict. And Ukraine should have enough infrastructure for producing enough weapon, for buying weapon, and Ukроборонпром is a part of it.
But the key here is transparency, is to having transparent, large state-owned companies that have transparent procurement systems, for example.
It's a question, but it's not privatization of this company.
Right.
This should be open. As for the other companies, we should look at this list, and because one of the reasons that companies was not privatized, probably loss of interest to them or bad time. The best example is famous Ukrtelecom. At the moment when it was at the peak of its price, it cost $5 billion. The current price of Ukrtelecom, I'm not sure it is very high. It's just one example. I think that if we look to other companies exist in our state property, first of all, as I understand Mr. President said about the necessity of understanding what we have. So recollecting all assets and to understand, because sometimes he has statements that government don't have full information about all assets situated in its control. It's of course not correct. So you're the government of the state, but you don't know the total list of the companies belong to you. So you should have a recollection of these companies, and then we will see. Because when we say that we privatize them, but we don't know whether there is an interest at the market to those companies. Because any company, it could be interesting to investments, but the other company could not be interesting.
Right. So how would the government go about finding out if any potential large state-owned enterprises are of interest to foreign investors?
So, first of all, I think that should be consultation with some, at least, companies.
Before,
of course. And understanding that will be the interest to these companies could be sell. And sometimes even with a higher price than it exists. As for the companies that has no interest, but it should be clear procedure of accounting them, yes. If there is no interest to them, probably we should think about lower prices, because at least in governmental procurement aspect, when we talk about this sphere and state property and selling state property, I know the situation when we have problems with some assets that government purchase, want to sell, but they could not sell it lower than price that they purchase. And that is a problem because they are losing price with time. It's the same situation with those companies. We should understand the real price of this company and whether the interest exists. Because without interest, sometimes it's better just to have either lower price or to think how to change it. But I understand it's very hard, because sometimes we said that let's make unprofitable companies profitable, but we have a market, and if market determines that this company is unprofitable, it will be very hard to turn it.
Right, and you just mentioned land reform. President Zelensky has also called on Parliament to cancel the moratorium on the sale of land by December of this year. So what sort of benefits, long-term and short-term, can Ukraine expect from this sort of law?
Actually, Ukraine is one of rare list of countries that has a closed market of land. As I remember, it's Albania, and that's all probably in European continent, probably Belarus. But the factor of selling land, it's one of the factors that could promote our growth. When we're talking about possibility of our growth, of GDP growth, I want to mention some research that said that the opening of the market of land give additional 2% of GDP growth annually. Only that factor, because in the year of 2005, 2006, where after Orange Revolution, some foreign companies expressed their will to build their plants on Ukrainian territory, to car producers like Toyota, giants. And they said that we want to build several plants that produce cars, you can export it, but it will be under our brand. But when they start to analyze situations, they said that, guys, you have a problem, not clear situation with land. You have the closed market of land, no clear understanding. We could not purchase land where will be our plants, that's why we will not build them. And they built them in Slovakia, near to Ukraine. And now, 15 years after, Slovakia exported cars for more than 20 billion per year.
So that's something that Ukraine potentially missed out on.
Yes, that's what we lost due to the fact that we have, as of 2005, 2006, closed market of land. What we lost. And we know that something that we failed to gain, that means that we lost it. And we failed to gain that, and that's why we lost.
But so how will this affect local businesses? How will this affect farmers? They're some of the opponents of the moratorium, the sale of land. Are those potentially small businesses and farmers who think that they're losing land? What sort of argument would you say against that?
I understand that, of course, for small farmers it's a problem, because when we're talking about such a global thing like opening market, it's of course plus for big companies who could invest large monies. But let's be frank, if we looked at the situation with current agriculture holdings in Ukraine, some of them controls more than 600,000 square meters of land, an enormous land. So, but officially they could not do that as we have closed market, but actually they do. That's why situation, first of all, I don't think that every land will purchase by the large companies. That's why small farmers could find its place, like small companies, for example, from cleaning and something like that. They found its place in the global economic map for serving for some big companies, so organizing outsourcing for them. The same situation could be small farmers who could be efficient only on the small part, but really be efficient and giving efficiency higher than the large company, because we understand that without introduction of new IT technology in the agriculture, Ukraine losing enormous quantity of money from our land, and only with attracting investments that help due to that law, we can seriously increase the profitability of our land.
Right. So, based on your arguments, I would say there are a lot of positive sides. Now, President Zelensky has also instructed the government to develop and adopt laws on legalizing the gambling industry, and like we spoke before about precious materials like the production of amber in Ukraine. Now, this is part of a huge sort of shadow economy that Ukraine, that the government is trying to get rid of. And he set the date for before December 1st, 2019, the laws on legalizing the gambling industry and the production of amber should be adopted. What sort of effect will this have on society, do you think?
So, first of all, about amber. Amber, it's always a long-term problem for Ukraine, but everyone understands that this market exists. And why government could not easily sell that, it's always was a corridor for some, as for me, corruptional schemes. Because everyone knows that it exists, everyone knows that people do that, but officially we don't try to say that government has no connection to it. Of course, it should be clear rules. Because for me, it's a situation seems with the prostitution in the Netherlands. We understand why the Dutch goes on the step, because I understand that for them to create from this illegal service, legal service, yes, with some rules, but legal. The same situation with amber. So I think that now
I think those are two different things, though.
Hard to say, because for me, analogy the emotional attitude of the people, because people has negative reaction. Let's be frank. I'm not sure for the Netherlands, but
I think when we're talking about legalizing gambling and legalizing amber production, I think these two industries have been very lucrative, and I think they have made some people very, very rich. Now, how can the government make it so that these sorts of industries don't benefit individuals?
I understand that, yes, will be a serious groups that will be against government in that steps, because really it's their land of profit, let's call it. So they received a lot of money, and they corrupted previous governments for them not touching this area. Now much depends on the readiness and the will of the current government to show that they're not so corrupted as their predecessors, and they're ready to attack that grey market, creating rules on this market and
following through on those rules, and that's very important. And
yes,
we look forward to seeing more developments in that story. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
We've been joined by Ivan Us, the Chief Consultant Department of Foreign Economic Policy at the National Institutes for Strategic Studies. You're watching UATV.